Welcome back, Meridian. I hope that you had a good break and that you had a chance to think up your best blockchain policy questions for this next panel of leaders who work with policymakers all over the world, trying to pave the way for a clear regulatory future for blockchain. We've got Sheila Warren from the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Kristen Smith, the Executive Director of the Blockchain Association, and Julie Stitzel, Vice President, Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. SDF's General Counsel, Candice Kelly, is moderating the discussion. Candice, over to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. It's great to be here, and that was a very exciting and interesting way to start off the day with Jim Young Kim. And I am really excited to be here with, as Justin pointed out, three women who are leading the charge in policy and regulatory, both globally and domestically. I think that my takeaway so far from the past couple of days of this conference are that crypto and blockchain are here to stay. And whether leaders and policymakers and regulators fear it, embrace it, understand it, is a question that all of the women here on this panel work on every single day. So I'm excited to hear their perspectives on that. And to that point that blockchain is here to stay, I want to start with you, Julie. You're at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is, I think, has been around since 1912, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us a little, this week, the Chamber published a report with recommendations that includes recommendations related to digital assets and fintech. Can you talk to us not so much about the content of the report, which hopefully we'll have time to get into later, but just the significance of your organization delving into this space and kind of how that the inside workings of how that came to be? Julie, I think, is Julie on mute maybe?
I think Julie might be in the attendee section.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I don't know how to, we'll have to try and get Julie
to
sign out and sign back in.
There she is, there she is.
So as an attendee, Julie, were you able to hear my question?
Here, let me start my video too. As an attendee, I can tell you that your conference is phenomenal, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think I did hear your question, and that is, what is the significance of the Chamber engaging in this space? And I'm happy to talk about that. First of all, I think the Chamber is an old institution, but when you think about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you know, we're the world's largest business organization. And when you think about emerging technology, it makes sense that an entity like the U.S. Chamber would tackle such an issue as blockchain and digital assets because of the way we're set up. We've got a presence at the state level in the U.S. We have a strong presence at the federal level, and then we also have an international reach. And so when you think about a borderless technology like blockchain, like digital assets, it makes sense that the Chamber is engaging. And also, you know, as the world's largest business organizations, we're working with financial institutions and industries across the globe that recognize the changing nature of our global economy, but also the importance of staying up to date with the technology that they're using to reach consumers and customers.
Well, it's great to have someone with Julie has policy background in from every angle. She's been in the private sector, the public sector, nonprofits, think tanks, legislatures, and so it's great that the U.S. Chamber and you are really jumping into the space. And I think that as policymakers and influencers, we often look towards what's the next existential threat that we need to derail, or what's the myth that we need to dispel. I want to start with each of you just looking a little backwards and trying to think of what is the most positive development that you have seen in this space in the past year. So let's start with Kristen.
Great, thanks Candice, excited to be here. I think as I look back over the year, I think the most positive development that we have seen from the policymaking perspective is that policymakers, whether they be regulators or lawmakers, are starting to see crypto as a solution, particularly to payments issues. And I think a lot of this was accelerated by the current crisis, but I think it was also getting some key regulators in the right spot that were able to start paving the way to make this happen. So I think for me, looking back, I think coronavirus has strangely been an opportunity for this space because it's forced lawmakers to think differently about the technology than they were before.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think we all need to look for those reasons why the coronavirus brings some new perspectives and positive things that we can draw from, because it's obviously taking its toll. But all challenges bring us some good. So Sheila, what from your perspective from the World Economic Forum, looking at a more international reach, I think than Kristen does, although blockchain is global, so we're all working globally.
Yes.
But Sheila,
So true.
what's your positive development?
Yeah, thanks, Candace. And again, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. I actually think a lot of what's coming out of China is really exciting, but also positive. I know there's some controversy around some of the things that we're hearing, but I actually think that the NDRC, which is the National Development and Reform Commission, earlier this year announced that blockchain is going to be an integral part of the country's technology infrastructure, a critical part of the stack. And I think that when you just think about sheer scale and adoption, that is one of the biggest developments I think happened in the entire world. What exactly that's going to mean is still remains to be seen a bit, but this is a very high level government agency that draws up policies and strategies that really help shape the entire Chinese economy. And I think that given that, and then the DCEP, the experiments that we see in China rolling out digital yuan, I think that those two things in combination really portend we're just moments away from a really massive change in how blockchain is being used in production and really construction.
Great, and I want to get back to you on talk about China, but I want to give Julie a chance to address what she thinks is the most positive change in the past year.
So yeah, I think it was somewhat unexpected, and this is piggybacking off of Kristen's point, in that we really moved to more of a cashless society, and because of the pandemic. And one of the things that struck me when we were talking about in the U.S. getting stimulus checks to all Americans when we were trying to weather this economic storm is that, digital currency wasn't a viable option or a considered option in that, and it just signals, a slight shift, but important shift, I think, in the thinking domestically in the U.S. And then to further iterate Kristen's point, having a regulator in place that is intimately familiar with the private sector's operations of blockchain and digital assets and crypto, I think has been helpful to move the conversation at a pace we feel is necessary to stay competitive with folks outside of the U.S.
Yeah, I think all of us in this space, as the stimulus check issues were discussed and in the news, thought, oh my gosh, if only this was really, the infrastructure was in place, this would be so easy. So hopefully it has spurred a conversation. And if you listen to the experts, this isn't our last pandemic. So hopefully this will help us all be better prepared for the hopefully not, but if there is a next one. So Sheila, I wanted to get back to you and ask you about, it sounds like from your first answer and your focus on China, I may know the answer to this, but from a global perspective, is there a country that's really getting it right and a country that others should be looking to as they are designing their regulations and policy around this space?
It's such a tough question to answer because getting it right is really context dependent. And certainly, certain kinds of policies that will work in an economy like China's are not going to work in many parts of the world. So if you're looking at this, really neutrally from a sheer numbers perspective, well, then obviously talking about the population of China and businesses that, all of us engage with in China, there isn't another more impactful place, in the world. But that you can't really export a lot of those policies anywhere else. So, I would kind of point to two different places that I'll mention. So one, I do think China, from the standpoint of just mass scale experimentation, ability to kind of roll out, test things quickly in production, iterate, experiment, all of that. There's a system there that makes that very possible, and we would all be very wise to pay attention to what the experiment is yielding to the extent we can get information about what's happening there. But I think that Bermuda is actually doing a totally different country, totally different, context. is doing a phenomenal job thinking about regulation. They're looking to be super regulation friendly, for a variety of reasons. And so the Premier of Bermuda actually says that one of the things Bermuda exports is regulation, where essentially this kind of regulatory structure that they think is very friendly to various participants around the world. So I think that approach of being very business positive, being very future thinking, of really trying to pave the way and lay the groundwork for longevity within the system is the right approach. And again, the specifics of Bermuda's regulations are to some extent, related to what Bermuda is looking for and needs, et cetera. But there's a lot that the rest of the world can learn from the philosophy that underlies those regulations.
Yeah, well, I think as you alluded to, there are some democratic principles and privacy issues and things like that that would make it difficult for the U.S. to learn and model after China's approach. But I'll turn to both Kristen and Julie from your different perspectives to ask about, do you think that in the United States there is openness? We tend to be the leaders. Is there openness in the U.S. from either industry perspective or regulator perspective, policymaker perspective, to look outside the U.S. and try and learn from places like Bermuda and potentially China with modifications? So I'll start with you, Julie.
Absolutely. And I think that looking outside of the U.S. Positions the conversation for a healthy level of competition, because there are certain criteria, particularly for China, when you think about that the population of China, I think, is 1.4 billion and change. And then you've got, I think I read 36 million Chinese living outside of China. So that's roughly 20% of the world's population. So if China launches a digital currency, or when they do, you've got probably an immediate uptick of 20% of the population using that. Not to mention that China's also, is the world's largest exporter. So they have lanes into other countries. And so I know when we're talking about the US's position with respect to digital assets broadly, we recognize sort of lessons learned and also the pace at which conversations are happening outside of the US as a way to catalyze the conversation domestically. And
Kristen?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely there are a handful of policymakers and folks in industry that are looking abroad to see are there regulatory frameworks that are happening overseas that we can implement here in the United States. Unfortunately, I think the U.S. has a decent framework in place, but there still are some issues that make it difficult for new projects to get started and launched in the US, and the compliance challenges around some of the existing regulations don't necessarily make sense for a blockchain network where you have so much transparency into that network. So I still think we have some work to do in the United States, and part of the challenge when we do look abroad for inspiration is that the way that our regulatory system is set up in the United States is we don't have a single uniform regulator. We have a lot of different agencies. We have the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, the FDIC, and it makes it very challenging to just kind of take what people have done elsewhere, because we have such a sort of a fractured regulatory environment. So I do think we have some challenges that we continue to work through, but I'm hopeful as more and more people start to use the technology that that the regulation will catch up.
Yeah, on a related note, and sort of picking up from what Jim Yong Kim said earlier in his opening of today, he talked a lot about the importance of global governance, and he was focused on things like the pandemic and climate change. I would say that blockchain is also a similarly borderless technology, and particularly with cross-border payments and other uses for the technology. How do you see the leadership of global, like leading some sort of a global approach to blockchain? And obviously we're sitting here in the US, so I tend to be a little bit too US centric. So maybe we'll start with Sheila and ask about, how you see that evolving right now. What do you see as the next next steps, and then I'll turn to Julie and Kristen to kind of chime in on how you see the United States regulators and policymakers either playing or not playing in that space productively. So Sheila?
Yeah, one thing I'm finding really interesting is the approach that regulators around the world are taking to DeFi, and just the way that it's different. It's different from how they initially respond to Bitcoin, for example, or even kind of the notion of there's a little more of understanding and willingness to kind of let the experimentation happen, let some of the innovation play out, let some of the experiments fizzle and die, which I think is really healthy. I think initially in the early days of Bitcoin specifically, we saw a quick rush to either like ban it outright or like try to attract it and draw it into were interesting and very extreme, responses. And there really wasn't, there was some over time, but at the beginning, there really wasn't a ton of kind of very normal, I would say, kind of rational, approach to this, and the realization that, these things do go through cycles, and that there are consistencies, there are things that really have longevity and things that kind of don't have longevity and die on the vine. So I'm finding that very heartening, and I think it just shows how much attention regulators are paying to what's happening in and around this space and some of the opportunities. So now, what I think is people always talk about, could there be global regulation, one giant global regulation, and I just don't think that's ever been particularly realistic, and I don't see that as being particularly realistic here. What I hope is that the principles that underlie regulation will be global, and then you can kind of localize regulation for what is really seen as being necessary given the priorities of the circular economy. These are also political questions. We can't separate. They are going to change as political leadership in the country changes, and that's something really important to note. But what I think that we try to do at the forum is really ensure that foundationally there is some sort of consistency to what is being modified in each region, and that consistency enables people, the builders in this space, to really build with some confidence and security that there's not going to be something that comes in any jurisdiction meaningful to them that suddenly just eradicates their entire.
Yeah, let's turn, Julie, what are your thoughts on what Sheila was just saying about sort of having a framework rather than a global governance standard? But do you think that from your constituents and your experience that that's something that is possible, is a good idea, a bad idea?
Well, I think the consistency is certainly preferable for businesses, if not more so certainty too for engaging in the space. And Kristen alluded to a bunch of the different regulatory agencies in the US that have jurisdiction or trying to work out where their jurisdiction lies with this emerging technology. And while that is a challenge, I think that's also a strength, because throughout our entire conversations, I think, process, at front and center are the safety and soundness of our financial markets, which have ripple effects, or that safety and soundness is important for not just domestically, but globally, I think. When it comes to, my mind often goes to data privacy when I get this question, because you think about how data is borderless, and you saw what happened from a regulatory standpoint and policy standpoint when Europe came out with GDPR, and that sort of became the floor or became a template for others to follow suit. And then what happened in the US, we're still having conversations about a data privacy regime, and then you have states that are enacting legislation. And I think the result of that is a patchwork in which businesses have to operate, which can sometimes be extremely onerous and potentially stifle innovation. So I think a framework is great, and consistency is great. Businesses rely on certainty, and hopefully we'll be able to find the right mix there, the right balance.
Yeah, I love your privacy example, having dealt with some of that, and being in California and now San Francisco, where we just, on top of the California privacy rules, San Francisco as a city and county just passed a proposition to add a whole nother layer of privacy rules. So always a challenge to have that kind of a patchwork approach, and helpful to have a larger framework, I think. So Kristen, turning to you, obviously we're talking, Sheila mentioned that as politics change, the engagement changes. We're here in the United States, and you spend a lot of time, you're in Washington, you spend a lot of time with regulators and folks on the Hill. With the changes, and let's for today's conversation assume that it's going to be a Biden administration and a split Senate. I know those things are not necessarily decided yet, but just for sake of, so we don't go off on where do you see the bulk of your energy as the lead for the Blockchain Association being focused in the new makeup of Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. No, I actually think if it is the case where we have a Biden administration and a Republican-controlled Senate, that's actually a pretty good place for the crypto ecosystem, because I think that combination will lead to hopefully some sort of common sense, sort of middle of the road, sort of reasonable guidance that's here to stay, right? Because what happens when you have, either something too far to the left or something too far to the right, that inevitably sort of gets undone. So any policies we want to be done by that are sort of middle of the road, mainstream, agreed upon policies. But I think what's interesting about crypto policy is that because it still is, sort of a niche issue, we don't have kind of an overarching framework coming from the top. And so what happens is the individual regulators that are sitting at the heads of these key agencies, whether it be the Securities and Exchange Commission or the CFTC or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, they end up playing a really critical role, because it's often the individual personalities and preferences that drive where those policies go. And we've seen that, here in the US, the SEC has not been particularly sort of active and favorable towards the crypto ecosystem. And that was largely driven by Chairman Jay Clayton, who, didn't really care for the space. Contrast that with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We have Brian Brooks there. He came from Coinbase, he knows crypto, and he's been able to take some action. So I think what's going to be interesting as we look to the weeks and months ahead is figuring out who does Biden nominate to be in these specific positions, and do they already have an understanding of crypto networks and how they work and their potential? Because the biggest barrier that we face when we're trying to when we're advocating for change is that it takes so long to educate people about how this works. Once we get there, they see the benefits and they can see the vision, but it takes a lot of conversations to get there. So I think we'll be ahead of the game if we have somebody who's there who understands the space.
Yes, and I have so many questions, and there are lots of questions coming in. So one that came in, which touches on what you were just talking about, I will jump to, which is, if Brian Brooks gets confirmed as U.S. Comptroller of the Currency, what changes do you expect to come in regulations?
Yeah, well, that's I mean, most of what's come out of the OCC to date has been interpretive letters and working with the existing laws. So it'll be interesting. I mean, there's a lot of questions around the timing of if he can actually be confirmed, and if he's confirmed, how long does he stay after that? There's sort of an uncharted pathway there. But no, I think that I think we'll continue to see him take some actions. He's indicated that he's interested in stablecoins, he's interested in DeFi. So I think he hopefully has some more positive sort of tricks up his sleeve. But maybe more importantly, he, I think, is very good at working with his fellow regulators and talking to them as a peer about these issues. And so, I'm hopeful that we can keep him there a while. But I do think there are some other good names in the mix that if we're not able to have him, I think there's some potential to get some, at least fintech friendly faces in that seat.
Great. So speaking of, who the people are and how they will address certain issues, one of the big issues that's been discussed both domestically and internationally is DeFi, peer-to-peer, self-hosted wallets. And I know Blockchain Association just came out with a report this week on that.
Yeah.
So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that, and then switch over to Julie and Sheila just on the broader topic of what are the impediments, like how do we get regulators past this fear that anything decentralized or not centralized and peer-to-peer creates an incredible risk for anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, you name it. So I'll start with you, Kristen. And
Yeah, no, I mean, and I encourage anyone to check out our website, theblockchainassociation.org. We have a report on our policy issues page there on self-hosted wallets and the future of free societies. It's a guide for policymakers. We think it's really important to have a conversation about why self-hosted wallets are critical to cryptocurrency networks, and having a digital peer-to-peer way to transact with one another is really important for a lot of different reasons, including financial inclusion and financial and privacy, but many others. And I think it was actually interesting. Someone reached out to me today on LinkedIn and said, hey, if cash were invented today, it would be illegal. What we're trying to do with these technologies is preserve the ability for people to have a cash-like option in the years and decades and centuries ahead of us, right? We need to have a better way to transact in this new world. So I highly encourage anyone who wants to get the 101 to read that. We are working with lawmakers. I do wake up in the middle of the night sometimes. I think if we do have one threat, it is sort of a misunderstanding about the role of self-hosted wallets, with certain policymakers. And so, I think I'm hopeful that we can overcome that, but it's definitely something that we're thinking about and watching and tracking, and want to make sure that we allow the very purpose of this technology to be peer-to-peer to still continue to be a part of these systems.
Great. And Sheila, how are you seeing this conversation playing out more globally?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly going to defer to Kristen on and self-hosted wallets specifically. I think on the topic of how we're getting regulators to a place where they can kind of remove some of the fear and understand this, I will, without trying to be scary, I do think we're at a point in time where many regulators know enough to be dangerous. And as we get into these more nuanced topics around, we're ready on the plus side, we're ready for conversations about things like self-hosted wallets, which is a pretty nuanced discussion, right? For where we started even a couple of years ago. On the other hand, there is a high cost of potential for misunderstanding for people who kind of really just go surfacey and don't kind of go that next level down. So I think that we're doubling down on education. We're doing more education now to global policymakers, I would say, not just necessarily regulators. We're going back to kind of what we were doing in 2017 around that. I think it's really, really important. I'm pleased to see that as an ecosystem, we have come to kind of consensus on the terminology. Like the lexicon is in a better place than it has been, which is helpful because I think that we are often talking about the same thing and the audience knows we're talking about the same thing. The audience is regulators. But I do feel like we're at a point where I echo Kristen's anxiety dreams, right? Like I do feel like we're at a point where there are people that are kind of tuning out a little bit to some of this detail because it gets pretty technical and not necessarily understanding all of this. So where we're going is on the to kind of flip this all around to say it in a positive way, we're finding a lot of progress when it comes to talking about the programmability of money, because that immediately is something that a lot of policymakers will land on. When we talk about China, we say what's interesting about DCEP is really what's programmable and what's not and how they're thinking about that. And that is something I think that policymakers seize on because it's really interesting and it does have implications like taxation, certain kinds of data, trade, balance of trade questions. Like these things are really interesting as a general matter. And the idea of having accurate, reporting on some of the things that can happen if you do use a blockchain or are using digital money, I think it's really interesting. So we try to kind of land it with some of the use cases and potential, and then back out into some of the technical components that we think are important to understand. But starting with like, what's in it for you? What's in it for your economy? What's in it for your country? What's in it for your political party? Is often the place that we look at.
Education. And I noticed yesterday I was listening to, it was Ratna Saheb from IMF who focused a lot on educating people as well, users, which we spend so much time thinking about educating regulators so they understand, but I think having a more educated population is going to move this discussion forward as well. So one last question I'm going to ask Julie, if you had one policy initiative that you could focus on in the next year, what would it be and why?
So it's more broader. It is on education. I feel like that gap is so significant, and it's really the biggest challenge for us in the U.S. is mitigating the education gap for policymakers, but also for consumers. And I think on a high note, we've got 60 million Americans who are engaging in the crypto space right now, and I think it's only going to increase in number.
Great. All right. Well, I think our time is up already. I think we probably could have had this group speak all day. And I thank each and every one of you for being here with us, for sharing your insights, and for all of the great work you're doing to move the policy and regulatory space forward. And I'm happy to be joining you in that quest. So thanks very much.